Welcome to another episode of The Plunge, and we finally made it to the end of the regular season and finally into the playoffs, and even before that, the play-in tournament, the inaugural play-in tournament. So let's start with just wrapping up this weird 2020-2021 NBA regular season. 72 games, a bunch of postponed COVID games, and even just like looking at the end of this season, a lot of teams still had something to play for in the final one or two games. Like you literally, especially the Western Conference, you look at literally every seed from 1 to 9, they had something to play for. Like the Warriors, Grizzlies, they had to play each other to battle for the 8th spot, which is important for the play-in. You had the Mavs, Trailblazers, and Lakers all tied at the end, and the Blazers trying to avoid the play-in there. The Clippers tanking like crazy so they wouldn't be on the Lakers side of the bracket, assuming the Lakers finish 7th. And then you have the Suns and Jazz trying to play each other out to finish first and try to avoid the Lakers. So, Nate, where do you want to start? Even just like what did you notice this regular season, the beginning, middle, or end of the regular season that kind of caught your eye?
Some things that caught my eye throughout this season was really like with the COVID stops, you had a few teams, primarily the Wizards, who really had a tough first half of the season, on and off. They've got 8 guys playing in games. They really can't build much chemistry between that Beal and Westbrook backcourt. And the second half of the season, they just put it all together. They made a good run. They ended up with the 8th seed, which is huge because that gives you 2 chances to make it. And they are playing a beat-up Boston in the first round of the play-in tournament. And all of a sudden, you're looking at them as a potential matchup with the Nets, which everyone would really love to see. But it's been really interesting, injuries, the Lakers in a position where no one thought they would be playing the Warriors in the first round of the play-in tournament. And then you have teams who had relatively healthy seasons, the Suns, the Jazz, not many COVID stops at all, just building a lot of momentum in the first half and being able to create a sizable gap between them and the other teams in their conference. And it was just really interesting to me to see, even though I don't necessarily think the Jazz are the best team in the Western Conference, being able to string together games and not have pauses this season was so integral to so many teams' successes and really the positioning that they are in going into the playoffs. And who knows how that will shake things up, because you have some teams who are worse seeded who are potentially still really good teams. Of course, the Lakers come to mind. The Wizards, the Celtics have talent. I don't know if they could put it together. And the Heat, obviously playing the Bucks in the first round is like the Bucks' worst nightmare this year. But just the up and downs of teams throughout the season, how discontinuations have hurt, and how some teams have really been able to put it together after rocky starts.
Yeah, for sure. And even the thing that kind of led to all this tension at the end of the regular season, where teams still had something to play for, was obviously the play-in tournament and the idea of it. So I think let's just jump into that before we even preview those matchups. Like, looking at the entire concept of the play-in as a whole, like what is your opinion on that, and even just how, like, what do you think of just your impressions as an NBA fan, or even just as some sort of analyst? Like, what do you think of this play-in tournament, and how good of an idea is this for the league?
Yeah, well, I love the play-in tournament because it gave all these teams, like, you have Chicago, who really was poor down the stretch, but they were still playing for something. Sacramento was still playing for something. New Orleans was really close to making the play-in tournament, and they were playing tough down the stretch until Zion went out. But there were so many teams who usually would just be like packing it in early and starting to tank, who continually competed this year just because the proposition of getting the 10 seed was so interesting to them, and it gave them hope throughout the season. And it gave the fans more interesting basketball to watch, because if you have a game of the Lakers playing Sacramento near the end of the season, all of a sudden the implications this year are so much greater than they'd be in years past. And so you're getting quality basketball, you're getting the star players still playing down the stretch for teams who are probably out of the playoff picture this year. And of course, the end result is that we get a Lakers-Warriors play-in game, which is absolutely crazy. And I think a lot of people thought the Warriors would be in the play-in game. Obviously, no one picked the Lakers to be in the play-in game. But you just have such great matchups of actually high-quality teams. So, yeah, it's done such a great job for the league. And this week should be a really interesting one moving forward.
Yeah, and I think there's always two sides to this play-in tourney. And I think it ended up well, or how people imagined it in the Eastern Conference, where it didn't really end up how people thought it would turn out in the Western Conference. Because in the East, you had the Wizards, and like you said, just their entire story of the season of just having a horrible first half and then just rebuilding and getting it back together in the second half. Like, remember when Bradley Beal was just sitting on the bench so depressed after scoring 40 every night in the first half of the season? Like, that felt so long ago and just felt like it was another lifetime just because of seeing how they've picked it up this second half of the season. And with the play-in, that kind of helped them find that spark to fight for that 10 seed. And look where they ended now. They've ended up past the 10 seed and even in the 8th seed now. But then when you look at the Western Conference, no one never thought the Lakers would be there. Even if especially if you're like a Lakers fan, or even like the Lakers organization, like you're just thinking this play-in tournament is horrible. And that's what LeBron said. But you know, I think for the fans, like overall, you're setting up for a Lakers-Warriors matchup. And I think that just really adds another dimension to the rivalry between Steph Curry and LeBron James over the past 6-7 years, where before you'd always thought you'd expect them to meet in the finals, because that's what they've been doing for, I think, 3 or 4 straight years in the finals. And they've been seen as the top 2 players in the league who changed the game, where LeBron's probably maybe one of the best who ever played, and Steph is clearly the greatest shooter of all time. And you have these two just duking it out year after year in the finals. But then this year, things have changed, obviously, with the Warriors. Things have changed with the Lakers. But now you have them playing in the play-in tourney. And they're not fighting for an NBA championship right now. They're fighting for one of the last seeds of the Western Conference. And I think just even adding that extra dimension really says something about how you can just spin rivalries in a way where no matter where they place, no matter how good or bad their respective teams are, you know you're going to get a really good game. And credit to the play-in for really facilitating this. So let's kind of jump into this first matchup, because that's probably the most anticipated game out of all the play-in tourneys. So in a 1-game series, Nate, what is your take on this? What are your thoughts? What's your outlook from this game?
Yeah, so when I look at this Warriors roster, the thing that is so clear to me, and is so clear to anyone who's watched them throughout the season, is they are a team who can lose to anyone on a given night and beat anyone on a given night. And it all hinges upon Steph Curry. They are a team who is wildly inconsistent. They can be blown out by 30. They can beat a great team like Brooklyn or Philadelphia or Phoenix or Utah by 30 on another night. They just beat
the Jazz
right?
and Suns back to back like the other week.
Yeah, but I don't trust them in a 1-game series. I think matchup-wise, you look at these two teams, like, if you convince yourself that Draymond's going to stop AD, I can't get there. Draymond has done a great job on star bigs in the past, but AD is so dynamic, like one of the most skilled big men to ever play the game. And, of course, you just have no real matchup for LeBron. Like, Wiggins improved defensively, but he doesn't have the size. He doesn't have the IQ to manage LeBron throughout a game. And so from that standpoint, like the Lakers' physicality, the Lakers' ability last year that they showed to win games when they need to win games, like every game 2 last year of every series they played in, they won. First, you had them playing the Trailblazers, and they lose the first game, and they just come out knowing they need to win that second game, and they get it done just because of the physical nature they are able to play with, the tempo. They can control the game so well, whether the ball be in AD's hands or LeBron's hands, and therefore, the consistency rides with the Lakers, and then that kind of the health of LeBron, which seemed to be reasonably good in his last 2 games there. I just don't see a way in which they lose his first game.
Well, LeBron did go down with what was seen as re-aggravating his ankle the last few minutes of the Pelicans game, but he said he's good to go. But for sure, that is a big question heading into Wednesday's game, is really the health of LeBron and also AD, because he's been kind of banged up the past couple of games. But I think the NBA fan in me wants the Warriors to win, but in reality, like referring to all the points that you just made, I think the Lakers will come out on top. But I would say, just watching Steph and Draymond play together, like even against the Grizzlies and I guess the entire season, like their chemistry is really like no other, I think, when it comes to just Draymond being a really good facilitator within 1 foot of him on the court. Like the way Steph just runs around him in a circle and he's able to receive those backdoor, all those underhand, those flip passes from Draymond, and while Draymond sets a screen for him to get like that slither of daylight for him to pull up that shot. I think it's really remarkable in terms of just how highly skilled and smart they are in terms of moving the ball. So I just want to highlight that part out.
Yeah, they definitely run kind of like yo-yo sets at the top where they suck together and then the screen happens and Steph curls around his screen just on an open 3 like all the time, especially late in that Grizzlies game. After Dillon Brooks went out, Dillon Brooks was doing a really good job of defending Steph in that game. But just the ability to create open looks, to break double teams, to fake the backdoor cut, like it's been so explosive all season. But I don't feel good about their chances in this one despite that. And one more thing to note, the last time we saw LeBron and Steph in a winner-takes-all scenario, it was Game 7 in Golden State in 2016 after a 3-1 lead. I'm not saying that's what we're going to get here, but the last time they came together for a winner-take-all, there was some fireworks for sure.
Very true. Very true. But now the Warriors don't have Iguodala on them for LeBron to block.
Truly.
Or that could go the other way if you're Max Kellerman, because remember when they asked him, who do you want taking the last shot? Curry or Iguodala?
Yeah. Universe on the line.
I want Iguodala.
I'm going to tell you, I think although Iguodala is gone and he may not be able to be blocked this time, I think Wiggins could admirably fill in that role.
That is so true.
We'll see, but I think he definitely has the potential.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess another question you could ask before we move on is, if there was any way the Warriors could win, it could not only be because of the Lakers' health in question, but also who can really keep up with Steph with him running around. Like, sure, you have Schroeder, KCP, and Caruso, but Schroeder just came back. Caruso can pick you up full court, but I don't know if he can really keep up with him. And you have Matthews too. Like, can anyone really keep up with Curry? And how much of an impact would that make for this game? Like, would it at least make it a close game?
I don't think anyone can ever keep up with Steph Curry, but really the same could be said for Damian Lillard last year. Like, when they played the Trailblazers last year in the bubble, the Trailblazers were unbelievably hot at the time, and maybe they ran out of steam, but the physicality of the Lakers, like, you can't underestimate them in the sense where you have, sure, Caruso, like, kind of a joke in some sense, Ernie's son, whatever you want to say about him.
The bald eagle.
He does bring a lot of defensive intensity, though, and Schroeder last year, he was playing against Russell Westbrook and James Harden in the playoffs, and he wasn't their best defender on OKC. Of course, that's Lou Dort, but he was doing a really good job picking up early and just being very physical with Harden, and that is obviously a similarly difficult matchup in a different sense, but still, you just can't underestimate how the Lakers can wear you out. They don't necessarily have one specific perimeter defender who they could deploy, but by committee, they do continue to be able to stop elite guards, and they stopped plenty of elite guards last year. So I'm not too worried, but I do think obviously you're dealing with a different dynamic in Steph Curry where he's running off 15 screens and then shooting from the corner. But they will probably find a way to at least mitigate him in some sense, whether that be in a playmaking sense and kind of letting him score and not get the rest of the team going, or maybe holding him down to kind of trust his teammates.
Yeah, for sure. I think even like if Steph scores 45 or 50, they can still lose the game just because of how inexperienced or incompetent their role players are. So moving on, just to wrap up the Western Conference play-in really quickly. I don't know if you want to spend too much time on this, but I think the next matchup for the play-in is the Grizzlies and Spurs. I guess to sum everything up, who would win the Grizzlies-Spurs matchup? And assuming the Lakers win, would they be a match for the Warriors for that 8th seed?
This is probably the absolute least interesting game I can think of. Like, the Grizzlies, everyone wants to talk about John Morant. I really didn't see him take any type of jump this season. Like, he's very kind of confined to his role right now where he can't shoot the three, so he can't really expand his game. So it's all just kind of attacking the basket. And that puts a lot of pressure on the other playmakers on the Grizzlies. Like Kyle Anderson, I mean, he's so slow, but he still makes plays effectively. And Dylan Brooks, he played really, really well against the Warriors the other day. And he can be an X factor. But they're just not a very interesting team. Like, their highest scorer is Valanciunas, who's kind of your typical back-to-the-basket scorer. And they don't bring that much excitement apart from a couple of Morant dunks. And sure, I think they can beat the Spurs because they're a more consistent team. With maybe the emergence of Jaren Jackson Jr. starting to come back to us later in this season. But the Spurs, I don't see this team really doing anything. Like, they're kind of a team who's still searching for an identity of, are they going to move on from the veterans, Patty Mills, Rudy Gay, DeMar DeRozan, and move to Dejounte Murray, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson? Or are they just going to stay in this kind of purgatory where Dejounte Murray isn't really able to develop and DeMar DeRozan really takes on most of those playmaking duties? I think the Grizzlies win. I don't really care about the result of this game, although I think because of the erratic nature of the Warriors, if the Grizzlies do find a way to win and Steph has an off game in the second play-in game, then it may be a little bit worrisome, but I'd still take the Warriors regardless of who wins this matchup. But if I'm picking, I'll take the Grizzlies, and I will take them to lose to the Warriors in the second game.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's really that much that needs to be said about the second play-in game.
I think this is the only real fault in the play-in game this year, because, like, if you had Zion, I don't love Zion's game by any means, but if you had Zion in this play-in tournament for the 9 or the 10, then it's like,
yeah,
people are gonna watch,
Yeah.
Like, who cares about the Grizzlies or the Spurs this year? Really, like, apart from their fan base and people who still think Morant is a top 5 point guard in the league, which he's definitely not right now. He has loads of potential, but he has to figure out that 3-point shot. But like, just two teams that I could not care less about. This is the only fault in the play-in tournament this year I could see.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, if the Pelicans were in the play-in tournament, this would be like the most picture-perfect bracket in the Western Conference you could get when it comes to TV ratings and all that. But anyways, moving on to the Eastern Conference, there's some similarities between the play-in teams here, where it's like you have two teams where their entire season is derailed with injuries or whatever, or just basic like huge struggles internally, externally on the court as well. But you also have two teams who you probably wouldn't think would be here, but they scratched their way, they clawed their way through injuries, through whatever trials that they've been through this season, and they're hungry for a win. And so it's the Celtics and Pacers whose season has just completely fallen off the rails, and then the Wizards and Hornets who are just trying to claw their way. So it's Celtics versus Wizards and Pacers versus Hornets. So pick your matchup. Who do you want to talk about first?
How about we start with Hornets and Pacers here? Because this game, I talk about who cares about the Grizzlies and Spurs, and the Hornets and the Pacers. No one really cares about the Pacers, but the Hornets are an interesting team. Obviously, LaMelo Ball, like probably one of the top 10 draws in the league right now in terms of just like fan exposure. Like people have known about LaMelo Ball for the past 5 years, since he was a freshman in Chino Hills. But he's just tantalizingly talented. He's been a highlight reel all year for them. And I like this Hornets team. I really like what Rozier has been able to do with his career there. Devontae Graham is explosive. Miles Bridges finally putting up those highlight dunks like he was in at Michigan State in college. And then, of course, you have some role players there. PJ Washington, who's been good. Cody Zeller, who can still kind of play at times. And this team is fun to watch. They're talented. They can really compete with some of the top teams at times. But people don't want to talk about the Pacers, and I don't really think they're that interesting of a team. But if Malcolm Brogdon is playing, if Karis LeVert is playing, if Sabonis is playing, like, this roster, when you go through it on paper, is so much better than they've been this season. Like, Brogdon is a borderline all-star. Sabonis is an all-star. Karis LeVert's a top prospect under 25 years old. And they just continue to put up huge stats. Their team is very poorly coached. But I think they do have the talent to win a game like this. Karis LeVert's been going off since Brogdon's been out, and Sabonis continues to put up triple-doubles. He had a triple-double and a half this year, too, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But a really talented team who has a really, really terrible coaching staff. But when it comes down to a big game like this, I think the talent often can win out, just because it can become such an isolation type of game when it's a winner takes all. So I do pick the Pacers in this one, but it's going to be an exciting game nonetheless.
Only if Brogdon and Sabonis plays, it'll be exciting. But yeah, I think you also forgot about Malik Monk too. I think the group of Ball, Rozier, Graham, and Monk, it's such a punchy, explosive tandem of guards that you can never go up against, where they're just all athletic. They can just do magical things on the ball and off the ball. I think the Hornets are really fun to watch, and even just going on the Pacers side of things, it just shows how just the coaching can really derail your entire season, no matter how good your team looks on paper, right? Even that drama between Goga Batadze and that assistant coach guy, it just looked really bad. And I think that's when it's like, okay, their season's over. How have they even maintained their place in the play-in tournament through like all the stuff that they've struggled through this season? It's just crazy. And it's crazy because at the beginning of the season they're off on like a 3-0 or 4-0 start, and we're like, oh my goodness, Nate Bjorken's such a good coach. Wow, Sabonis is the best player. It's like, oh my goodness, this team is so good. But then you're like, wow, Bjorken is just so bad. You should have kept McMillan. Like, I have no idea why you just let him go like that last season. But yeah, it'll be an interesting game if Brogdon and Sabonis play.
Yeah, man. McMillan's been killing it with the Hawks, too. Like,
for sure.
They were really struggling before with Lloyd Pierce, and then he comes along, and they're just the team that they should have been all season after he takes over. It's definitely really interesting. Like, Bjorken, whatever, he comes from the Nick Nurse coaching tree. But it is interesting to me how many guys come in on the scene and they have success at the start. Like, you have another example in Mark Dagno in
for the Thunder?
Yeah, for the Thunder this year. And they get off to a hot start. They're playing around 500 basketball. I don't blame him as much because that team definitely tried to tank this year. Like, they played like the most they played 5 guys. I watched the Thunder. They played 5 guys in some of their starting lineups that I just did not know. Like, absolutely absurd. But it's definitely interesting. Like, some of the first year hires, Nick Nurse, for example, when he was hired by the Raptors, won the championship the first year. You have to be both a good X's and O's guy and a good motivator, though, because you can see, like, Nate Bjorken's strategy was fine when the team bought into it, but when you're not a good motivator and you don't work well with the team stops buying in, and that's what you've seen with the Pacers throughout this season.
Yeah, although I wouldn't put the Thunder on the same level as the Pacers, just because the disparity between talent level and the rosters is quite large. Just because the Thunder are really, really bad and the Pacers are way better on paper. But yeah, I think for sure it'll be an interesting matchup if, again, Brogdon and Sabonis play. But moving on to the Wizards and Celtics, again, Boston, another team that their team has just been derailed by not just COVID but injuries as well, and just Jaylen Brown out for the year with that wrist thing. It's like, oh my goodness, what else could go wrong in the Celtics season? But I think it's pretty clear cut for me in terms of who's going to come out on top with this game. You know, the Wizards have more urgency coming into this game, way more than the Celtics. I think the Celtics are just like, this is a done season. We just got destroyed by whatever happened this season. Let's just move on. But I don't know. It just seems so clear cut for me for the Wizards to beat the Celtics. Even if Bradley Beal's not 100%, I think Westbrook has that will to get his team over that hump, and all of that momentum that's built up through that last second half of the season. I think it's led to this moment. I don't think Westbrook would really kind of choke. He would kind of step up his game here and really kind of take the game over.
Yeah, I think when you look at the first few rounds of the playoffs in Russell Westbrook's career, he's mostly been good within the first 2 rounds. It's when you get to the conference finals that it really becomes an issue. Wizards take this one clearly. Celtics, like, apart from Jason Tatum, like the last section of this season for Jason Tatum, his season's been pretty disappointing. Marcus Smart, I love Marcus Smart. He's really struggled this year. Kemba's finally been better, but I do think, like, the role players on this team are absolutely dreadful. They have no one to fill in for Jaylen Brown, and they are going to get torched by Westbrook in this one for sure.
Yeah, there's not really much else to say about that matchup. So moving on to the 4 matchups that are set in stone already for the playoffs. We're just going to preview them. And it's so interesting looking at these 4 matchups, because you have 3 matchups out of these 4 that are just a lot of deja vu coming into it, where it's like the Bucks and Heat, they just played last season in the bubble, and now the Bucks have Drew Holiday. And then you have the Nuggets Blazers, who 2 years ago went to 4 OTs and the Blazers came out on top in a game 7 with CJ coming up clutch. Clippers Mavericks last year. You have the Doncic and Marcus Morris beef and all the Kristaps Porzingis thing and all the texts going on there. So I think those three matchups are just a lot of it's like a round two for all of these matchups. And then you have the Knicks and the Hawks, two teams that didn't make the playoffs last year. Even the New York Knicks just creating so much hype around the basketball world. They're finally relevant in the NBA thanks to Julius Randle, Derrick Rose, Tom Thibodeau, all those guys there. Playing a Hawks team who's really deep on paper and who are really young, and they all have that firepower. But everyone's been questioning, like, we never seen Trae Young play in the playoffs before. Is this the year that he really shows everyone what he's made of? Like, can he close games? Can he do this? Can he do that? So I think it's a really interesting first round matchup. So you pick one, Nate. Which one do you want to start with?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few first round series this year where the teams who have positions from 1 to 4 are like, what the heck? Like, I worked so hard all season and now I have to play this team. And obviously the first one, like Bucks and Heat, the Bucks are grinding away all season. They have some issues with kind of trying to fit the roster together at the start of the year. They're trying to play a different offensive scheme, and they really start to play it together in the second half, and they're really grinding. They're getting that in position for that third seed, and you look at the standings, and all of a sudden it's like, are you serious? Like, we have to play the Heat the first round of the playoffs after being the 3 seed, working hard for home court advantage. We play the Heat the first round. My first reaction to seeing this series is that it's going to go 7. The Heat are not what they were last year. The Bucks are better than they were last year, but Jimmy Butler. And that is like all you need to know about the Heat, because Jimmy Butler is the worst shooter who is a good shooter in the playoffs. Like, throughout the season, he could shoot 25% from 3, but if you have 30 seconds left in a game and you're down 3, you're giving the ball to Jimmy still. And this series is going to really just be a battle, because you have guys who are going to step up, and Dragic and Adebayo like last season. And this Bucks team is not the Bucks team we saw last year. They run a better, more efficient offense. You see the ball in the hands of Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday. They create plays. They have Bryn Forbes shooting. Brook Lopez is declining still. He's definitely not getting better than he was at his peak in 2018. But the rest of the roster is really improved, and I like this Bucks team. I think they win this series, but you're really asking yourself, like, what did we put all this regular season work in for? Like, they would much rather be playing the Knicks or the Hawks without question, and yet they have to match up with this Heat team who put them out in 5 last year.
For sure. And sure, like, you have Drew Holiday, and I guess the problem that they had for the past few years now is, like, what's your closing lineup, right? And the past couple of years, you realize that Middleton is just such a great player and he can close games now, but he can't carry a team like Lillard can or Curry can, where they just go on insane scoring runs. And I think adding Drew Holiday really adds another element of just a shot creating and just getting a bucket when your offense kind of stutters and just stops working, just because he can just body his way down to the paint and get his own bucket too. But you ask yourself, like, is that enough to make this series a winnable or easily winnable series against the Heat? And I don't think this game is, or this series is going to be short. It's probably going to go to 7 games. But it's crazy to think that if the Heat somehow pull this off and the Bucks are just a first round exit, like, how devastating would that be to the franchise, and just in terms of just working their way up the past 5 years with the emergence of Giannis, him winning MVPs, him doing this and doing that and all that, all to come to this. It feels like some sort of peak they're at now, where you finally have Holiday, who's a great player, but then you unluckily match up with the Heat just because Miami had a horrible start to the season where they had gotten hit hard by COVID and all these things, and they were tired from the bubble last year, and they dropped to the 6th seed when you think on paper they would be more of like a 4 or 5 seed, and you'd assume in a normal season that you would not be matching up with them in the first round, and you would be seeing them in the second or third round. But now, like, in the current circumstances, now you're like, oh my goodness, what did we get ourselves into? We're playing a team that came off of a finals run last year, and we have probably the best team here, and of course we have the hardest test in front of us. So I think, yeah, it'll be a good series. It'll be a tough series for sure, but it'll really speak to how much resilience this Bucks team will have.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I like more about this Bucks team too. Like, in the years past, they've kind of played this team defense BS where it's like 5 guys are defending the area at one time, but no one really matches up with one another. Yeah. They've definitely gone away from that. Also, given the fact that Drew Holiday is an absolutely elite defender, and Eric Bledsoe was like one of those Kyle Lowry elite defenders where it's like, sure, he takes some charges and he bodies guys up all the time, but you don't want him to actually play defense on the other team's best perimeter player because he's too short and he's going to get torched at the end of games. And that was kind of the situation with Bledsoe. 1 was that, and then 2 was the fact that he forgot how to play offense every single postseason. Drew Holiday did not forget how to play offense in his last postseason appearance with the Pelicans when they swept the Blazers. And he is an elite defender that you absolutely want on the other team's best player or best perimeter player when it comes down to crunch time. So I do think this Bucks team has evolved, and I really see a very slim chance of them losing to the Heat, although I think it'll be a very long series.
Yeah, for sure. It could come down to a coaching chess match, and experience shows that Spoelstra's better. You could say he's better at making adjustments more than Budenholzer, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Moving on to the Knicks and Hawks. 2 teams that kind of caught us all by surprise in terms of where they seeded. Like, we thought they'd all be a bit better, but not this much better. So what do you see coming out of this matchup?
You know, I think these might be the 2 worst teams to make the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. Sorry to Hawks and Knicks fans, but you have to look at this matchup and you're like, okay, the Knicks have an elite defense in the sense that the Bucks had an elite defense for the past 2 years where they play very good team defense, but individually it doesn't really make sense. Like, Julius Randle has always been a minus defender. Derrick Rose is no defensive stalwart. Like, they aren't really elite defenders. They're an elite team defense, which usually doesn't translate to elite defense in the playoffs. And the Hawks have an insane amount of firepower. They have so many players who can continually get their shot. You have Bogdanovich, you have Trae Young, you have John Collins, who rolls hard off screens and can shoot the 3, Gallinari off the bench, Kevin Huerter, DeAndre Hunter. I think Cam Reddish is still out, but you have like an insane amount of players who can shoot, who can really get to the basket. And I see this one as maybe a Hawks in like 5 or 6 games. Unfortunately for the Knicks, since they've had such a resurgent season. But this Hawks team is deep and they play together, and Capella's been outstanding this year defensively and getting putbacks. I really like this team. We've talked about them a ton this season, and I think they'll really just outplay, and they just have too much firepower for this Knicks team.
Yeah, and I think the loss of Mitchell Robinson really hurts you here, just because of in terms of defending the pick and roll of Trae Young and Clint Capella. Like that tandem alone is really hard to stop in the league. But when you have a chance in Mitchell Robinson, who's like a 7 foot plus defender who can hold his own against Capella, not having him and having Nerlens Noel as your defender, it is tough to kind of stop that kind of offense that the Hawks run. And I guess like you said, when what they can play team defense in terms of the Knicks. We'll see how that plays out and how they defend Trae Young. But when the game slows down in the playoffs and people play more iso ball, especially when you have Trae Young and even Bogdanovich, he can do that too. Like, you really don't have that elite individual defense stopper on the Knicks. And like you said, like Rose is no way he's gonna do that. I don't know if Barrett is experienced enough to do that. Quickly, no, probably not. He's too young as well. So yeah, it is really tough to kind of stop the offense of this Hawks team when things slow down during the playoffs and people rely more on iso ball heavy stuff than team offense or just freelance stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It'll definitely be kind of a series where the Knicks realize what they need for next year and where they need improvement. And that's usually a good thing for teams moving forward, to have a tough playoff series and improve on that in the years following. So moving on from that, I'm going to ask you about this one because you definitely care more about it than I do. But we have the Denver Nuggets playing the Portland Trailblazers in the first round. Obviously, Jokic, Dame, CJ, Michael Porter Jr. But my first question to you, obviously, go on about who's going to win this series, but if you had to pick one player to be the X factor from each team in winning this series, because I think it's a pretty even series with Jamal out, but if there's an X factor for each of these teams, who do you think it will be and why?
Man, I don't think there's really wrong answer here, because you can go to a whole bunch of different players, but I think the first player that comes to mind for me, and this might be kind of out of, like, might not be a common choice, would be Facundo Campazzo, the short point guard rookie, 28-year-old, I think, rookie, 29-year-old rookie from the Nuggets.
Yeah, I think he's 28.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because he can be just that weird guy, that weird smart defensive guy that can get in people's heads defensively. Like, he kind of gives me a little bit of Patrick Beverley vibes, and watching him play this season, he's a smarter player than most people think. Like, he can get to the hoop when you don't expect him to. He can make those passes to Jokic and all that, because I think you're gonna expect what you're gonna expect from Jokic. I don't think, like, Nurkic is a great defender, and I'm a Blazers fan, so of course I'm trying not to be biased here. But Jokic is going to get his triple-double every game too. I don't think, like, Nurkic is a good player, but he's not enough to really affect Jokic's play a lot. Like, he can, of course, limit it a bit, but it's not enough, especially with the not good Blazers defense. But I think Campazzo would be a huge X factor in terms of just not only providing for the kind of like facilitating the offense like how Jokic does, but he's that kind of extra player that you think, is he really going to perform, or is he just going to not be a huge factor in this game? Because you know what you're going to get out of Dame and CJ. You're probably going to know what you're going to get out of Porter Jr. He's going to hit those contested shots. Aaron Gordon, I don't know. You could say he could be an X factor too. You have no idea how he plays in the playoffs, but I don't really think offensively he really has that much to bring to the table when it comes to the playoffs. So I think with that being said, Campazzo is probably the player, as a Blazers fan, I'm just looking out for, just because I could see him being a really frustrating player to watch against the Blazers.
Yeah, I think when you look at kind of even the international players, like, a lot of kids in the US grow up watching playoffs and they get really nervous for the first couple playoff series. And that's where I see, yeah, maybe Aaron Gordon does struggle, just because he's grown up with all these NBA dreams and expectations. Facundo does not seem like the type of guy to change his game at all for the playoffs, and he has been sneaky at times. But I think the biggest X factor for this series is probably Robert Covington, in my opinion.
Ooh, interesting.
Just because Michael Porter Jr. has been unstoppable in the second half of the season. Like, he's been averaging close to 25, and he's been really effective against a lot of different defenses. And, like, he's gone up against the Clippers, had success there. But I think Covington does possess that rare physical kind of stature where he can stop the drive. He's long enough to contest the three, and maybe he can bait Michael Porter Jr. into making some bad decisions. I don't know if the Blazers are going to win this series. I would personally pick the Nuggets, but
Oh, okay.
I think if there is an X factor for the Blazers to win this series, it would probably be Robert Covington.
I've watched more Blazers game than you probably this season. And let me tell you, I don't really think Robert Covington has that much to give in terms of defending Michael Porter Jr. Just because of two things. One thing is obviously Porter Jr. can shoot over people. He can shoot over arms. It doesn't matter who's contesting him. So I don't really think the length of Covington will really bother him that much. And number two, Covington's not really good on-ball defender after watching him this season. Like, he is like barely average when it comes to defending players on the ball. And it frustrates me how many times he jumps so high on pump fakes and he's taken out of the play like right then and there. Like he bites for so many pump fakes. Like, yes, I understand that you jump so you can intimidate guys when they shoot, but like 90% of the time when they pump fake, he jumps and they just blow by him, and that just leads to an entire defensive breakdown. And the Blazers defense themselves are already an entire breakdown with Covington on the floor. Doesn't matter. They're just really bad on defense to start with. So in my opinion, I don't think Covington can really hinder Porter Jr. that much on the defensive end. But when it comes to the offensive end, yes, I agree. He could be an X factor for the Blazers just because they are a deeper team than most people think when it comes to offensive scoring. Like the past few games, they've been playing really well this month, and the past few games where they've blown out teams you look at the box score and you see like, wait, Powell only had 10 points, but they still won by 20, or like you're like Covington only had 6 points, 2 for 6 from 3, but they still won by 20. Like, you have those kind of box scores, and that just really speaks to the depth. But when it comes to players hitting big shots in the playoffs, every shot matters. And I think Rocco, his shot was really bad to start the season. It was a bit inconsistent, and then he's kind of gotten hot throughout the season. And then I think the past couple of weeks he's kind of cooled down a little bit. So I think when it comes to relying on someone to make a shot, Covington kind of worries me the most out of the shooters that we have in their team when it comes to Lillard, CJ, Powell, and Melo. And you could say Anthony Simons as well. But Simons is shooting 43% this season. I think it's top 10 in the league. So, yeah, and especially because Covington will get a lot of minutes too. He will be a very important factor in the Blazers series against the Nuggets. When it comes to taking his share of threes, I think he'll probably get 4, 5, 6 attempts, and he's got to make at least 2 or 3 of those for them to get some wins out of this series.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to watch just because the Nuggets dynamic has changed a lot since Murray has gone out, but not necessarily for the worse. I mean, Porter's become a lot more involved, but obviously their success last year was based on the fact that Murray found a new superstar level in the bubble, and you're not going to have that, and someone's going to have to fill that void this year. And so it'll be interesting to see who it is. I think this is kind of the perfect series for the Blazers because I don't really see them with much of a chance against the Clippers. But
yeah, no way.
Who knows? Like, who knows what will happen in this series? It's really kind of a toss-up, in my opinion, and it'll be super fun to watch, though.
Yeah, I think also the injuries to Will Barton and PJ Dozier, and I think Monty Morris as well, that's going to be very interesting to watch as well, just because those are important rotation players you're wanting to play in the playoffs. And then one last thing, shout out to I think Alexei Pokushevsky of the Thunder for drilling that dagger three in the last minute of the Clippers Thunders game on Sunday, so the Clippers can actually tank and lose that game, so the Blazers will play the Nuggets in the 3-6 matchup. Man, Pokushevsky, wherever you are, I love you. You possibly saved the Blazers from a first round exit. Even Moses Brown too. He had that huge putback dunk to end the game there. Former Blazer, actually.
Big shout out to the Clippers, hey? Like they are a real talented tanking team. Like how you losing back to back to the Rockets and Thunder and still kind of trying to act like you're playing. Like very impressive job. I can't say enough about how badly they wanted to avoid the Lakers, and they were just able to execute it so well. So big shout out to them.
Did you know Yogi Ferrell still plays in the NBA? He was on the floor with the Clippers against the Rockets and the Thunder.
I did not know Yogi Ferrell still plays in the NBA. He had like a good season with Dallas one year, but you know.
And then he's just been a nobody the past 3 seasons or something. Like, and I think he scored like 14 points, 2 assists, 7 rebounds in 27 minutes, 5 of 12 shooting. Man, what a coming out game for him that against the Thunder.
I think it's really hard to find an actual 10-man roster of players who are like NBA caliber who are worse than the players on the Thunder right now.
Oh yeah,
especially with Dort and Baisley and SGA and Horford out for this season. Like it's really, really tough to find 10 players who are like roughly NBA caliber who are worse than that roster, because there are a bunch of nobodies on it right now.
Yeah. I just love that Thunder roster. I love Pokushevsky. Like me and you are like probably the biggest Pokushevsky fans in the entire universe.
He is the future.
Yeah,
the future
of the NBA. 7 foot, can do everything. Okay. Speaking of the Clippers, the last matchup we're going to in the playoffs, Clippers and Mavs. A lot on the line as well. I think when you look at the Clippers, this is probably their best chance to go deep into the playoffs, just because the Lakers are not healthy. The Suns and the Jazz are the 1 and 2 seeds. You really have the chance. I think you're probably one of the most healthy teams right now in the West, because especially since you've rested Paul George and Kawhi Leonard the past week or two. So what do you see coming out of this matchup against the Mavericks, and can the Mavericks really challenge them to 6 or 7 games?
I think we talked about this series at the start of the season when we were kind of doing our preseason predictions for the playoffs. And I was confident about the Clippers this year just because Paul George was healthy, got another season under his belt. But the one roadblock that I saw for them was playing the Mavericks, because Luka really is unbothered by Kawhi and PG on him all game. Like, he still does his thing no matter what. And that was so impressive to me in the bubble last year. Just his ability to step up his game, make big shots. And they were without Porzingis. They didn't really have the identity without Porzingis that they have this year. Like, they played a lot without Porzingis this year. And they've really built up that solid offensive first identity, but also more of a respectable defense than last year. Jalen Brunson, man, like, I can't say enough about him. He's just been so consistent all throughout this season, and he's really held down the fort even when Luka's off the court. And Tim Hardaway Jr., Maxi Kleber, Dwight Finney-Smith, Dwight Powell and Dorian Finney-Smith. They all just continue to step up and be very solid role players for that team. I see 7. I don't know. Like, who knows what happens with Paul George this season? Maybe he steps up. I like the Clippers. I would have taken the Mavericks in this one before the trade deadline, but I do like the addition of Rajon Rondo. I think that's super crucial for this Clippers team. Very close series. I love the Mavericks. I really wish they could win this one. X Factor, Porzingis without a doubt. But I do like Rajon Rondo and what he can bring to a very solid Clippers team.
Yeah, there's no question that the Clippers will come out on top for this. I just don't like. I just think Rondo. There's no way Rondo will let this team go out in the first round. Like, there's just literally no way. But I think the Mavericks will challenge them to 6 or 7 games for sure. But yeah, for sure. I think Porzingis is a huge X factor, and they'll just be a good litmus test for the Mavericks heading into next season. Just seeing if, man, is Porzingis really a good fit for Luka for the long run? And there's just been a lot of questions around that this season, even last season as well. Like, you just talk about his durability, like he just can't stay healthy, and even defensively, he's dropped off massively the past few seasons after having good defensive stats with the Knicks, right? And so I think that this series will really be, or even just this playoff run for the Mavericks will be very telling of their future, in terms of what they're going to do with Porzingis, how they're going to build around Doncic. I think the Mavs have really good players that surround Doncic. Like, you have good cutters, you have good shooters. Tim Hardaway Jr. is an underrated player. Like, I watched him when he was in the Knicks. Like, man, I was like, man, this guy can really get his own shot, and he's got a good shot at Sixth Man of the Year this year too. And you have Jalen Brunson, like you said, is a great point guard. Trey Burke even too. He's found his role as a kind of a third string point guard, but he's still found himself important minutes in games. So I think having that the mix of guards, of different guards who can do a bit of everything that surrounds Luka, as well as wings like Richardson and Finney Smith. It'll be very interesting to see where this team goes after this season, depending on the outcome of how they fare in this year's playoffs, for sure.
Yeah, I have one more question for you, I guess, to end this pod. But how many years do you realistically give Luka before he doesn't just feel good about a solid first round performance and like getting kicked out in a really tough Western Conference that will be that way for the next 3 years?
Man, that's a good question because, well, if you think about it, like the top powerhouse players in the West is like, it's LeBron, Kawhi, Paul George, Dame, Steph. They have, let's say, like 3 or 4 more years at max probably of their reign, and Luka's only 21 or 22 or something, 22. I think you can. I don't know. That's a good question, but it really depends on what they do in the off season.
It's I was just gonna say it's interesting because on one hand, like, for a great career, you could talk about MJ, and he didn't have success until later on.
Yeah.
But LeBron was carrying his team to the finals by like 23, 24 years old. I don't know. It's an interesting question about kind of where Luka will rank eventually, if you want to think long term, based on how many years does he have to waste before that playoff success is necessary.
Well, I think the one thing that really stands out, that really marks the difference between Luka and LeBron, is probably athleticism. I think athleticism is a huge factor in terms of physically carrying your team to the finals, and that's obviously what LeBron had. But Luka doesn't have that. And sure, you could say, like, with all the Luka LeBron comparisons, like, they both make like other players better. But I think the one thing that kind of elevates LeBron over Luka right now is his athleticism. And I don't know if he can really develop that if you're Luka. But I think he needs to rely more on the role players more so than LeBron when it comes to carrying your team, just because you don't have as much athleticism compared to him. And so I think it really depends on who the Mavs acquire throughout Luka's tenure with the Mavericks, that will help him carry the team to the finals possibly. And I think of course you could look at a lot of spots on their roster right now that are clearly upgradable. Like, you need a way better center who can defend. Not saying Porzingis is not a good player, but even looking at their backups like Willie Cauley-Stein and Dwight Powell, and even just better guards too, like Josh Richardson. He hasn't been shooting the ball well at all this season. So I think it really depends on what kind of role players you get, and you could possibly say like you maybe have to acquire a top elite player to make an official duo with Luka to make that happen. But I don't know. It could go a lot of ways.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether they try and add like a top 10 player to that team moving forward. But hopefully he has some good success in this year's playoffs and we can scrap these conversations.
Yeah, for sure. We're both huge fans of Luka, and I think he has a lot of success coming up, but with that potential success comes a lot of pressure. So that does it for this version of the Plunge. The play-in is exciting. It'll be fun to watch, and the upcoming playoffs, and we'll break down a lot of the upcoming matchups as well that are not yet determined later on. But for now, just sit back and relax and just watch the playoffs unfold. And so until then, we'll see you next time.